Senate will come to order. Dr. Black, chaplain of the Senate, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Immortal, invisible, God only wise, in light inaccessible, hid from our eyes. Lord, you have promised in your word that in all labor there is profit. Give our lawmakers today the profit of wise decisions that will bless our nation and world. Help them to see that with many advisors, there is safety. Make each legislator determine to do what is right as you give him or her the ability to understand your will and the courage to do your bidding. May our senators stretch out their hands toward you, depending upon you to lead them to a safe harbor. We pray in your holy name. Amen.
Thank you. Would you join me in the pledge, please? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session and resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of Commerce, Paul Dabbar of New York to be Deputy Secretary.
The Senator from Iowa.
Today, I want to bring attention to all of the selfless veterans that have served our country, especially those from my home state of Iowa. Each and every veteran has put a piece of themselves towards the mission of protecting our nation that we're blessed to live in. So, it is tremendously important to commemorate and thank these veterans. I want to give you one example of how that is done. The honor flights that take place at the World War II Memorial. The veterans that travel from across the country to here in Washington, D.C. represent big cities, small towns, and rural areas. But what they all embody is deep courage, sacrifice, and humility. Honor flights are just one small reflection of the gratitude that we have for these brave souls. I hope that for visitors to our nation's capital who have the privilege to witness an honor flight, it may inspire deeper gratitude to all the veterans. This is what I found when occasionally I get an opportunity to go to the World War II Memorial to meet the veterans that have flown in from Iowa. And many times I had the occasion, when he was still alive, former Senator Bob Dole of Kansas, even in his weak condition, being in a wheelchair there to meet those same veterans from all over the country, not just from Iowa. It is a priority for me to share their legacy with every new generation of Americans to foster a deeper appreciation for our republic. I yield the floor and suggests the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader,
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be suspended.
without objection.
Mr. President, next year, Congress fails to act, a typical family will face a $1,700 tax hike. A typical family in South Dakota will face a $2,500 tax hike. Republicans are determined to make sure that that doesn't happen. And later this week, we'll consider our reconciliation bill that will prevent that tax hike by extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I say extend, Mr. President, but we're doing a lot more than just extending the 2017 tax cuts. We're making them permanent. And in some cases, we're even improving on them. Mr. President, our 2017 tax relief legislation lowered tax rates for every income group. It doubled the child tax credit. It nearly doubled the standard deduction. The bill we're voting on this week will make all of that permanent. And it will go even further when it comes to the child tax credit, increasing it to $2,200 per child and linking it to inflation, again, permanently. And we're not stopping there. Our bill suspends taxes on tips, boosting the incomes of millions of Americans who earn tip income. It suspends taxes on overtime pay for millions of American workers, meaning police officers, firefighters, nurses, and others will be able to keep more of what they earn when they spend long hours away from their families. And an increased standard deduction for seniors will allow them to reduce their tax burden even further. Mr. President, the American people have better uses for their hard-earned money than sending it to Uncle Sam. And this bill will permanently ensure that Americans can keep more of what they earn. Mr. President, the other legacy of the 2017 tax cuts is how they boosted our economy by lifting the tax burden on America's job creators. We lowered tax rates for owners of small and medium-sized businesses, farms, and ranches. We made it easier for them to recover the cost of investing in their businesses, which in turn freed up cash for them to invest in their operations and their workers. These and other major reforms helped kickstart our economy. And in the wake of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, our economy grew at a substantially better rate than projected. Real wages increased. Unemployment fell to a 50-year low. The poverty rate fell to the lowest level ever recorded. Business investment increased. Everywhere you looked, there was positive economic news. Mr. President, we were able to make some of the business tax reforms permanent in 2017, and now we have an opportunity to make the rest of these pro-growth policies permanent. That includes lower rates for small and medium-sized businesses, the job-creating 199A small business deduction, and full expensing for new equipment and for domestic research and development. And once again, we're going beyond just making the 2017 tax relief permanent. We're setting our country up for a brighter future by further advancing a pro-opportunity, pro-growth tax code. Our bill includes full expensing for new factories and factory improvements, so we can expect to see more growth and more jobs for American workers and more goods made in America. It raises the death tax threshold to $15 million and links it to inflation permanently, which will spare countless family farms, ranches, and small businesses from a potentially devastating tax and the headaches and expense of planning for it. And an entire generation of Americans will be able to be able to access new investment accounts when they reach adulthood that can be used toward their education, to start a business, to buy their first home, and to get a running start on the American dream. Mr. President, this is a good bill, and it's going to be great for our country. The Council of Economic Advisors, which accurately predicted the economic growth and higher wages in the wake of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, released its forecast of the Senate bill this morning. It contains a lot of good news, starting with as much as 4.9% higher GDP in the next few years. That means more jobs. It means bigger paychecks, as much as $10,000 per year for a typical family. It means more opportunity. And I should say, and believe it or not, it means more revenue. Revenue that we bring in the right way, by growing our economy, not by raising taxes. In fact, the same forecasters that got the effects of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act right are estimating as much as $6 trillion in deficit reduction stemming from the bill's pro-growth policies. Mr. President, we're well on our way to getting this bill passed this week, which means we're well on our way to a stronger and more prosperous America. That means Americans keeping more of their hard-earned money. It means American businesses growing and investing in our country and in our workers. And it means a thriving economy like we had before the pandemic. Mr. President, Republicans are ready to deliver. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of quorum.
We'll call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
President,
Democratic Leader.
ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the Trump administration has failed miserably in its responsibility to inform Congress about what is happening right now in the Middle East. Before the strikes, leaders in Congress got virtually no heads up. Then the administration delayed the briefing scheduled yesterday. It was scheduled a week ago. Now they're trying to get away with sending only the Secretary of State and Defense for tomorrow, instead of the usual intelligence officials that attend the briefings. Let's be very clear. Briefing from only the Secretaries of State and Defense would be woefully insufficient. If they are the only ones in attendance, they will only parrot whatever the President wants them to say. Sending intelligence officers to briefings in Congress is a long-standing bipartisan practice, and Congress is entitled, as the representatives of the American people, to hear from the administration about matters of national intelligence and national security. Refusing Congress like this would be egregious, troubling, and a violation. It would make Americans wonder, why would Donald Trump prefer to send two talking heads to meet with Congress instead of intelligence analysts and policymakers? Intelligence officials have an obligation to seek the truth, speak the truth. And perhaps that's why Donald Trump does not want to send the intelligence officials to talk to us. Maybe Donald Trump doesn't want Congress or even America to know the truth about what is going on. We know there have been a lot of confusing reports, some from intelligence sources, over the last days suggesting the strikes in Iran were not as successful as the President initially claimed. There may be questions about the accuracy of these reports. I have no idea if these reports are accurate. And today the President said earlier this morning that, quote, the intelligence was very inconclusive. The intelligence says we don't know. All this only underscores the need to hear from intelligence analysts and hear from them directly. What is the administration hiding? Were the strikes successful? How much enriched uranium does Iran still have? How many months will it take them to make a nuclear device? And are they locating centrifuges in a new place? And what is our knowledge of that? Are our troops safe? Are Americans in the region safe? Is the conflict contained? What happens next? And how will the administration achieve the critical national priority of preventing Iran from attaining a nuclear weapon? Both parties, by and large, agree that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. I do. But if the President is misrepresenting the impact of our military strikes, and these reports have some accuracy, we don't know if they do, and if the President is turning away from diplomacy with Iran, as his recent post suggested, then what the hell is going on? What is Donald Trump's plan? We really don't know the answers to any of these critical questions. The administration refuses to be transparent. All we get are talking points and tweets. We know that Donald Trump makes things up day to day and then has to retract and turn around. And tomorrow, all we're going to get are talking points from Rubio and Hegseth, because that's what we know they're trained to do. On top of that, today it was reported the administration may actually start limiting intelligence sharing with Congress. The administration should immediately undo this decision if it's true. Are they afraid of the truth? Do they want to hide the truth? The intelligence agencies are known to tell the truth. Is that why they're so afraid to get their information out, the information of the intelligence agencies out? As I said yesterday, the administration's stonewalling of Congress is outrageous, evasive, derelict. The administration has no right to stonewall Congress on matters of national security. Senators deserve information, and the administration has a legal obligation to inform Congress precisely about what is happening right now abroad. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll, please.
Ms. Alsop-Brooks.
The majority whip.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today because Republicans are making America safer and more prosperous. And as part of that, we are strengthening Medicaid. You know, I'm a doctor, practiced medicine in Wyoming for over 20 years, and I cared for many, many Medicaid patients my entire career. And I understand Medicaid's importance for the people that it is intended to serve. I've also seen its shortcomings. Medicaid became a law in 1965. It was meant to be a safety net for the poor, for pregnant women, for children, and for the disabled. Today, Medicaid has been stretched way beyond its intended purposes. Today, Medicaid covers 71 million people. Many of these are able-bodied, working-aged individuals. And as a result, Medicaid has become broken and bloated. Its costs are ballooning. It's going to go bankrupt unless we take action now to strengthen it. The Republican plan will strengthen Medicaid for those for whom it was originally intended. Our bill ensures that illegal immigrants do not receive taxpayer-funded health care. It's never intended for that. But 14 liberal states currently give free taxpayer-funded health care to illegal immigrants. Now, California, of course, is the biggest offender because they set up a money laundering scheme. The scheme is set up to siphon money from the federal Treasury to provide free health care for illegal immigrants. The 1.4 million illegal immigrants who receive free health care, they strangle Medicaid in the funding. They're filling up waiting rooms and clinics. They make it harder for Americans to get in to see a doctor. Our bill ends liberal states' magnet for illegal immigrants. Medicaid cannot continue to be a reward for open borders in sanctuary cities. Additionally, our bill roots out waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption in Medicaid. Experts tell us that in recent years, Medicaid has wasted over $1 trillion in improper payments alone. In 2021, 660,000 people were enrolled in Medicaid in more than one state. How can that be? That's costing lots of money. The Wall Street Journal did a breakdown of this. They found that these double payments alone cost American taxpayers over $2 billion. Republicans will not allow scammers to continue to game the system and steal money from taxpayers. Additionally, our bill puts in place work requirements for these able-bodied working-age adults. 21 million able-bodied adults are currently on Medicaid. An American Enterprise Institute study recently found able-bodied adults on Medicaid who don't work. How do they spend their time? Well, they spend over 4 hours every day watching TV and playing video games. It's 125 hours a month. They ought to be working or at least looking for a job. Our bill requires these people to work or train 80 hours each month to remain on Medicaid. That's a lot less than the time they're currently spending watching TV and playing video games. Senate Republicans are proposing a responsible path to self-reliance for able-bodied, working-age people. No more taxpayer-funded coddling. Let me share with you a story about a man whose son relies on Medicaid. This man's son has autism and epilepsy. Medicaid was designed to serve individuals like this man's son. Yet today, his son is stuck on a 10-year waiting list for in-home care. The man wrote about his family needs. He wrote a whole article about it. He titled the story, "My Son is Counting on Medicaid Work Requirements." Not for the son, but for others, so they get they start working and make it easier for this man's son to get the benefits that he needs. Medicaid is often called a lifeline. Years of waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption have pushed those who truly need it to the back of the line. Republicans are fighting for families like this one. We're making sure Medicaid is there for the vulnerable. Meanwhile, Democrats are fine with healthy working-age adults continuing to stay home, play video games, and receive Medicaid forever. Work requirements work, Mr. President. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton proposed that we end welfare as we know it. President Clinton partnered in a bipartisan way with Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich to pass bipartisan welfare reform. Bipartisan welfare reform lifted millions out of poverty. Even President Obama admitted, he said, we have to have work as the centerpiece of any social policy. President Obama was right then, and Republicans are right today. Today, every Democrat has vowed to oppose our common sense reforms, and Democrats' wasteful approach continues to drain Medicaid. Medicaid is for the truly needy. Medicaid is not for illegal immigrants or for able-bodied working-age men who refuse to work. Republicans are rescuing this lifeline so that it serves those who need it the most, now and into the future. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that we move ahead with the vote scheduled for 4:15.
Without objection. The question occurs on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Brett, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto. Thank you. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Marino, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Capito, Johnson, McCormick, Moody, Ricketts, and Schmidt. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Durbin, Hassan, Merkley, Murphy, Schumer, Van Hollen, and Welch. Ms. Warren? No. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Lujan, no. Thank you. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Warnock? No. Mr. Fetterman? No. Mr. Kelly? No. Mr. Rounds? Aye. Thank you. Mr. Justice? Aye. Mr. Peters? No. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Reed? No. Mr. Budd? Aye. Mrs. Blackburn? Aye. Mr. Langford? Aye. Mr. Wyden? No. Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Husted? Aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Hello. How are you? Thank you. Mr. Marino, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mrs. Murray? No. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Marshall? Aye. Mr. Lee? Aye. Ms. Hirono? No. Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Curtis? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? No. Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Schiff? No. Ms. Slotkin? No. Mr. Cassidy? Aye. Mr. Tillis? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? No. Mr. Haggerty? Aye. Mr. Kramer? Aye. Ms. Lummis. Aye. Ms. Alston-Brooks, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. McConnell. Aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 56, the nays are 40. The nomination is confirmed. I recognize the Majority Whip. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action. And now I recognize the Majority Whip.
I ask unanimous consent to waive the mandatory quorum call with respect to the Kies nomination.
Without objection,
Yield the floor.
the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Kenneth Kies of Virginia to be an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, signed by 17 senators.
Under the previous order, the mandatory quorum call under Rule 22 has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that the debate on the nomination of Kenneth Kies of Virginia to be Assistant Secretary of Treasury shall be brought to a close? Then yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks. Paul? Ms. Cantwell? Marshall? Kim? Okay, you're an aye. I'll get there. I'm going to. Thank you. Yeah, but Heinrich. Thank you. I'll get him. Sure. Thank you. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barassa, Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth. Thanks. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice. Thank you. No, thank you. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Marino, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters. I did, yeah, thank you. Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch. Thank you. Thank you. Cassidy. Okay. Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, I got you. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Cassidy, Kramer, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Haggerty, Hoeven, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, Moody, Moran, Marino, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Schmidt, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, and Tillis. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Bennett, Cantwell, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Kane, Kim, Klobuchar, Markey, Merkley, Murray, Padilla, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, and Wyden. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Cotton, aye.
Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Husted. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mrs. Britt. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. McCormick. Mr. McCormick, aye. Ms. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy. No. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito. Aye. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff. No. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly. No. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley. Aye. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Justice, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 44. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Treasury, Kenneth Kies of Virginia to be an Assistant Secretary.
Mr. President,
I acknowledge the Democrat whip.
Mr. President, we're here today to ensure the Senate fulfills its constitutional duties regarding the sole power to involve our nation in war. An important briefing will take place tomorrow and perhaps a vote on this very issue. Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution clearly states that the power to declare war is an explicit power of Congress. 3 words, to declare war. Congress overwhelmingly reaffirmed this constitutional provision when it passed the War Powers Act in 1973 over the veto of President Nixon. Under the War Powers Act, the President has the authority to approve military attacks as a response to an imminent threat or with the express authorization of Congress. Neither of these were the case with President Trump's decision to bomb Iran over the weekend. The Iranian regime sponsors terrorism, wants to destroy Israel and undermine U.S. interest and repress its own people, and it is interested in owning a nuclear weapon. But those are not justifications to ignore the Constitution. If the United States is to start a war with Iran over these or any other issues, the Constitution itself requires there must be the consent of Congress. Let me also add that we had an effective agreement that contained Iran's nuclear program. I remember it well under President Obama. That is, until President Trump in his first term abruptly withdrew the United States from this agreement, adding to the more volatile situation which we face today. That's why I support the Senator from Virginia, Tim Kaine's War Powers resolution. It requires a prompt debate and vote prior to using additional U.S. military force against Iran. This Senate should not allow the country to be led into another Middle Eastern war without its consent. Mr. President, when I reflect on the time that I've served in the Senate, one of the most memorable votes was on the question of the invasion of Iraq. If you recall that debate, the argument was being made by the White House that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and we had to preemptively start a war with that country to stop those weapons from being used against us or our allies. We know what happened. There was a vote on the floor of the Senate. It was about 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock at night. There were 23 of us who voted against the invasion of Iraq, 1 Republican and 22 Democrats. I believe it was the best vote I ever cast as a senator. There were no weapons of mass destruction. We were invading a country under a false premise. We were going to wage a war there, and unfortunately did at the expense of American lives for a long period of time. The Senate should not be led into another war in the Middle East without the consent of the American people through Congress. Our founders knew this point. One should never send our sons and daughters into war without the consent of the American people, an argument I've made regardless of who the president is, either party. We have already ceded too much congressional power on so many different subjects. I'm almost speechless, and that's something for a senator. We're at a point where Congress continues to give away its power and its authority. I don't know how to explain it. I don't know why people would go through the awful challenge of running for office to serve in the United States Senate, while each and every president tries to take away our authority to appropriate funds, for example, to make critical decisions. And so many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are willing to give that away to their favorite president. Well, you give away that authority, and the next president may not be your favorite, but he'll have the authority that you ceded and gave away under the previous president. We've already ceded too much power in appropriations and other key items. Let's not do that when it comes to war. Mr. President, on another topic, school may be out for the summer, but I have a pop quiz for the American people following this at home. The following statements are about President Trump's so-called big, beautiful bill. Try to guess whether a Senate Democrat or a Senate Republican made the following statement. Statement number one, if we don't watch out, people are going to get hurt. People are going to be upset. It's going to be the number one thing on the nightly news all over the place. Statement two, reference to the big, beautiful bill. I'm concerned if there are cutbacks in some of the Medicaid programs, it could have an adverse effect on our rural hospitals. Many of them are barely making it now financially. Statement number three, on the subject of slashing Medicaid payments. This is a whole new system that is going to defund rural hospitals. If you guessed that all three statements were made by Senate Republicans about the Republican reconciliation bill, you're right. Even my Republican colleagues know that under Trump's plan, billionaires will win and American families will lose. The more we learn about this bill, the worse it looks. Perhaps that's why the Senate Republican leader is anxious to pass the bill before the arbitrary 4th of July deadline. It is expensive. Yesterday, the Joint Committee on Taxation estimated that the Republican proposal will add $4.2 trillion to our national debt. In Trump's first term, in that 4-year period of time, he added more money to the debt of the United States than any president in 4 years in history. Now he's going to top that number with this new big, beautiful bill, adding to our national debt. And does the proposal borrow against the future in order to lift millions of children out of poverty or invest in clean energy jobs for the future that will grow the economy? Think again. This bill provides tax breaks to the ultra-wealthy. One of my colleagues did a calculation here. If you make a cutoff point of an income of $400,000 a year and say that we won't give any of the new Trump tax breaks to people making more than $400,000 a year, you eliminate 60% of this tax proposal. 60% of it goes to people making over $400,000 a year. What about at the highest levels, 0.1% income? The tax break, permanent tax cut, annually is nearly $350,000. Come on. Do you really believe Elon Musk is waiting to see this, whether this goes through, so he can take this tax break and spend it on something worthwhile? Not at all. The richest people in the United States, God bless them, don't need this tax cut. Working families do. And it's unpopular. A recent Fox News poll, did I say Fox? Fox News poll found that 38% of registered voters supported the House-passed bill. 59% opposed it. And it's downright mean. This measure would be the most significant health care cut in American history. 16 million Americans would lose their health insurance. I heard one Republican senator on the news say, well, that's just health insurance that we're providing for illegal aliens. He's wrong. The Medicaid doesn't cover them. Medicaid people who would be denied coverage, 16 million of them are American citizens. Medicaid cuts will lead to higher copays, longer emergency room wait times, and skyrocketing nursing home expenses. So many of our senior citizens in my state and other places are in places to take care of them. They need a helping hand, a nursing facility and the like. The majority of that is being paid for by Medicaid, and the Republicans want to cut that Medicaid reimbursement. What's that going to do when you're trying to take care of your mom or your grandmother if you can't afford to keep them in a good place? In an extreme situation, they may have to move in with you and change your own lifestyle and your own relationship within your family. One provision in particular in the Republican bill will cripple the funding mechanism used to keep hospitals afloat. According to Children's Hospital Association, this provision in the Republican bill will cut funding for most children's hospitals by 42%. So do you have a children's hospital in your town, in your state? 42%. Ask them what that will mean in terms of services for kids in your home. Take Children's Mercy. It's the Children's Hospital in Kansas City, serving kids in Missouri and Kansas. 35% of its revenue is from Medicaid. and the hospital operates with a 5% margin. If you take a chainsaw to Medicaid, families with 6 kids who trust Children's Mercy will have another worry on their minds. And in red and blue states, rural hospitals will be in jeopardy of closing. For what? For a tax cut for the wealthiest people in America? Really? Don't take it from me. I recently spoke with the CEO of BJC Health, the largest hospital system in Missouri, and a third of their patients are from Illinois, I might add. I asked about their concern with people losing insurance under this Republican bill. This is BJC out of St. Louis, Missouri. BJC Healthcare cares for more Medicaid patients than any other health organization in the region. More than a third of their patients are covered by Medicaid, paying 1 million visits a year. It's the same story for SSM Health, headquartered in St. Louis, operating 9 hospitals in Missouri, including the famous hospital Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. SSM CEO expressed her, quote, deep concerns about the proposed Medicaid changes in the Republican bill, stating that the Republican bill, quote, threatens coverage for millions of people and jeopardizes financial stability of safety net providers like SSM Health. For what? For a tax cut for the wealthiest people in America? 60% of this tax cut goes to people making over $400,000 a year. And at the highest levels, $346,000 annual cut in taxes for the richest people in America so that we can cut back on these hospitals. In Missouri, 250,000 individuals are expected to lose coverage under the Republican plan, resulting in Missouri hospitals facing an increase of $430 million in uncompensated care costs in a single year. I know these numbers are numbing, there's so many of them, and they're so big, but let's get down to the basic message. Hospitals that are hanging on, rural hospitals, hospitals in the inner city, children's hospitals, are the ones that are making it barely each and every year. They're the ones who will lose replacement of funds by Medicaid under the Republican plan. Why would the cuts be, what would the cuts mean for rural hospitals in Missouri? Already 10 rural hospitals are in jeopardy of closing. This Republican bill could be the final straw, and I hear exactly the same message across the river in Illinois. I heard this message from Unity Point Health, which has hospitals in Illinois and in Iowa. They told me that Medicaid covers nearly 40% of the children born at their hospital, and they rely on provider taxes to offer maternal, emergency, and behavioral health services. If Republicans have their way, these critical services are in jeopardy and some will go away. Todd Patterson, the CEO of Washington County Hospital in Iowa, said, quote, Medicaid is not a line item, it is a cornerstone. When policymakers in Washington slash Medicaid funding, they're turning off the oxygen for rural health care. I will tell you, I've grown up in downstate Illinois and I've represented it in Congress and the Senate. These hospitals are critical to the economy of these communities. You take the hospital out of a community, you've taken the major employer and a major economic factor. Try to attract a new business and explain the hospital is 2 hours away. Try to keep a new business in town when the hospital is going down. Currently, 107,000 people in Iowa are projected to lose health insurance under this plan. It would increase annual uncompensated care costs for hospitals by nearly $190 million. Republicans in Iowa and Missouri get sick and rely on their hospital just like Democrats. My colleagues know these Medicaid cuts would be devastating, and no Band-Aid hospital grant fund that Republicans are frantically trying to create will make up for this seismic hole. While President Trump said he would protect Medicaid, he is now pressuring Republicans to make deep cuts in the program. He's asking Republicans to choose billionaires over hardworking American families. Now is the real test for Senate Republicans. Mr. President, I can remember when it occurred during Trump's first term. Another tax bill, another massive increase in the national debt. How were they ever going to pay for it? Well, there was a proposal that a cutback on the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and that cutback was hanging by one vote in the balance. I was sitting here at this chair and watched as John McCain came through that set of doors at 2 o'clock in the morning. He was the deciding vote. John McCain walked to the well and gave a no and saved the Affordable Care Act from Trump's first term. Now we're going through this scenario again. Another Trump tax cut, more cuts when it comes to medical care, particularly for families who are in the most vulnerable. Will anyone rise to the occasion as John McCain did? We need 4 Republicans to stand up and say, enough. Stop penalizing the families of America and the rural hospitals of America and the small town hospitals of America for a tax break for wealthy people. We're better than that in America. It's time we need 4 Republicans with good sense to step up before it's too late. I yield the floor.
I recognize the senator from Louisiana.
I ask unanimous consent that the following interns in my office be granted floor privileges until June 26, 2025, Zach Fitzgerald and Carolyn Martell.
Without objection. I recognize the senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, when I was in grade school, my dad, the mechanic, would point to the schoolhouse doors and say, son, if you go through those doors and you work hard, you can do almost anything because we're so fortunate to live here in the United States. He was a big fan of public schools, giving an opportunity for every child to thrive. And I took his advice to heart and went through those doors and studied hard and loved the vision of opportunity for every child in America. But the fact is that many careers require more than K-12 education. And the cost of college has exploded. When I was graduating from high school, if you worked a summer job at minimum wage, which was about $3 an hour, you could save enough money living at home to pay your tuition at any of the public universities in the state of Oregon. Well, try paying your tuition today. A year of tuition based on minimum wage working the summer. We are in a situation where college is so much more important now than it was decades ago to so many parts of opportunity in our society, and yet it's so much more expensive. It's a huge barrier for opportunity for every child. Not so long ago, my children are 29, 27, not so long ago, they were in grade school in my neighborhood, my blue-collar neighborhood, and folks would say to me, Jeff, I'm not sure I should encourage my son or my daughter to go to college because I'm afraid they're going to end up with a mountain of debt. And that debt's going to be a millstone around their neck. Instead of creating opportunity, obstructing opportunity. And indeed, we've seen the challenge in which, because of the cost of college, our sons and daughters are marrying later. Because of debt from college, our sons and daughters are finding it much more difficult to be able to buy a home, which have been the primary source of family wealth for middle-class Americans. So we should do something about this. But unfortunately, my Republican colleagues want to make college more expensive. I wish you could come to my blue-collar community, get out of your gated communities where you live with people affluent enough to just pay their sons and daughters' education, and understand how expensive college is as a barrier to opportunity here in the United States of America. Specifically, they want to make it harder for children to afford college by eliminating income-driven repayment plans for borrowers. Income-driven repayment plans help folks responsibly pay off their student loans by basing a borrower's monthly payments on their income and their family size. Sounds like common sense to me. One of these income-driven repayment plans is the Saving on a Valuable Education, or SAVE plan, which more than 8 million Americans are enrolled in. But in the reconciliation bill, the proposed bill that we will be voting on later this week, it's slashed. And Senate Help Committee Republicans are attempting to slash these loans in their portion of the reconciliation bill as well. As a result of these cuts, the Student Borrower Protection Center calculates that the typical borrower with a college degree will pay about $250 more per month. Now, if you're coming from affluence, you're like $250 a month, less than 10 bucks a day, not a problem. But you know, it is a massive problem for children across America, our young adults across America, for our families who are not among those millionaires and billionaires that so often inhabit this Senate chamber. Why do Republicans want to get rid of programs that help individuals and working families, help lift them up and responsibly pay back what they owe, and instead want working families to believe that perhaps college is not a possibility because of the mountain of debt it will create on their children? It's a families lose, billionaires win. This attack on affordable ways to pay for college. It's another example of the big, beautiful betrayal in which this reconciliation bill puts families down and helps the rich get richer. Families lose, billionaires win. That's not a good theme for America. It's not good policy, not even good politics. How about we work together on families thrive and billionaires pay their fair share? I've introduced the Savings Opportunity and Affordable Repayment Act, or the SOAR Act, with Senator Kaine, with Leader Schumer, with Senator Sanders, to codify and expand the SAVE plan and help borrowers in 4 important ways. First, it will allow more low-income borrowers to qualify for income-driven repayment plans, increasing the number of students who will be able to responsibly pay back their loans. Second, it protects borrowers from runaway interest. Third, it incentivizes former students to keep paying their loans rather than default by shortening the timeline for loan forgiveness from a maximum of 25 years to 15 years. You know, CBO did a report on this back in 2020, and what they found is that those who participate in an income-driven repayment plan are half as likely to default as people who don't. So it becomes a win-win. More money gets paid back to the Treasury, not less. Finally, it will help many more borrowers by making them eligible for these programs by including Parent Plus borrowers and borrowers with federal family education loans. We know that the SAVE plan and other income-driven repayment plans work. They increase repayment rates, they reduce default rates, they lower costs for families, and they create a vision for our young folks that, yes, you can afford to go to college here in the United States of America. No, it won't create a mountain of debt that will be a millstone around your neck. Don't we want to send that message of opportunity to all of our young folks so they can aspire to their dreams, so they can reach their highest potential, so they can return their success in helping their entire community and our entire nation thrive? Yes, of course we do. So colleagues on both sides of the aisle, let's join together in the vision of families thrive and billionaires pay their fair share. And let's do that by passing the SOAR Act. So, Mr. President, I propose that the Senate proceed to consideration of the SOAR Act. And to give you the precise technical language for that, as if in legislative session and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions be discharged from further consideration as Senate Bill 1220, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, the bill can be considered read and a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
To object?
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I rise to object to S1220, a bill seeking to transfer the burden of $230 billion in student debt to the 87% of Americans who chose not to go to college or already responsibly paid off their loans. To be clear, this legislation does not differentiate between those trapped with overwhelming debt and those who could easily pay back their loans. If this bill is enacted, a majority of those who borrowed money to get a bachelor's degree would not have to pay it back, would not have to pay back even the principal on their loans. 91% of new student debt would be eligible for reduced payments, and it would be subsidized by everybody watching on C-SPAN right now. There is no free lunch. These policies are as unfair as they are irresponsible. Where is the relief for the Louisiana truck driver who took out a loan to buy a truck? What about the hardworking mom who paid off her student loans but now struggles to afford her mortgage? Would this legislation give those Americans relief? No. It gives them a greater burden. The truck driver, that mom, they're on the hook for those who decided to go to college to get a degree to make more money. They would be on the hook for that, as well as their own cost of living. Now, I'm sure my Democratic colleagues will argue that some of those students are trapped with overwhelming debt, and this legislation will help them get out of it. But this bill does nothing to address the broken higher education system that created the overwhelming debt in the first place. It doesn't address the rising cost at colleges and universities. And let's point out that in the last 30 years, tuition and fees at private nonprofit colleges have risen by 75%. At public four-year institutions, increased by 102%. Meanwhile, according to a nonpartisan analysis, 23% of bachelor's degree programs, 43% of master's degree programs have a negative return on investment. What does that mean? It means you spend a lot of money to get your degree, but you don't actually increase your ability to earn more money because of that degree, and along the way, you get into student loan debt. We need real solutions to fix this broken system, and Republicans provide these solutions. As chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, I'm leading my committee's portion of the One Big Beautiful Bill, legislation that will make transformative changes to the higher education system. First, it reforms student loan repayment plans that cost American taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars. This includes fixing our income-driven repayment program that is targeted to help struggling Americans. Second, it increases affordability of higher education by eliminating inflationary loan programs that evidence shows drives higher tuition prices and cost taxpayers billions of dollars. Third, it restores accountability so that universities are not receiving federal loan dollars for programs that leave students worse off than if they had never entered that program. And lastly, this legislation increases access to career or technical education through establishing Workforce Pell. A young person from Louisiana who wants to be a master welder doesn't need to attend a four-year university, but they can now use their Pell Grant to attend a technical school, giving them the skills for a successful career. That is a wise investment of federal student loan dollars. Unlike S1220, the legislation before us today, Senate Republicans are putting forth real solutions to address the root causes of student loan crisis. I look forward to working with my colleagues to get the One Big Beautiful Bill across the finish line so we can fix the broken higher education system and ensure that every American can succeed. Mr. President, Democrats' legislation is unfair to the hundreds of millions of tax-paying Americans who will be forced to bear the burden of paying off someone else's student debt. It would make our higher education problems worse, not better, and for those reasons, I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President,
The senator from Oregon.
I enjoy working with my colleague from Louisiana, and he's made several points worth noting. He's noted that this strategy of enabling people to pay back their loan according to their income doesn't solve the large issue of why our colleges cost so much. And he's noted that it doesn't do anything about predatory college programs that charge a lot and deliver little. Now, I was here when Tom Harkin led the effort to shut down the for-profit programs that often weren't even accredited, but were signing up veterans like crazy and ripping them off, leaving them with massive debt. And we couldn't get any help from across the aisle to take that on. So he's right, it won't solve everything. But the idea that you pay according to your income, and as your income goes up, you pay back more. And the default rate is cut in half. So the federal government actually takes in more money than it would otherwise. And students believe that they do have an opportunity despite the high cost of college, because that's just not going to be fixed overnight. You know, Germany, tuition is zero. Germany has said every child should have the opportunity to thrive. But here in America, we make it so the rich have that opportunity, and ordinary families in my blue-collar community are going, we don't think our children can afford to go to college. That hurts all of us. It hurts every child whose dreams are crushed because of these high costs of college. I'm happy to work with my colleague from Louisiana on ideas on how we lower the cost of college. But we've got a lot of folks going to college right now. Let's help these students know that they can go through those doors as a freshman, and if they thrive, they're going to pay back their loans fast. And if they don't thrive so much in a higher income job or it's a public service job, they'll pay it back more slowly, but they'll never have to default. I think it's a vision worth continuing to work on, because our higher education system is not working as well as the system in many other countries that are saying every child will have an opportunity. I believe, like my father did, like my mother did, of America as a land of opportunity for every child, not just the children of the rich. Thank you, Mr. President.
The senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Every day, our nation's ICE officers are putting their lives on the line to get criminal, illegal aliens out of the communities. And I wanted to see firsthand what they were going through, so this past weekend, I joined a ride-along with ICE agents outside of Nashville. Until you're actually on the ground, you do not appreciate the amount of work that goes into their operations. They are identifying the criminal illegal aliens. They are finding out where they are, and they're figuring out the safest way to surveil them and also to apprehend them. And it is so much more than a full-time job. As I visited with the agents, what I found out is that nearly every one of them are working 75 and 80 hours a week, dealing with some of the worst criminals imaginable. Now, when I joined the agents for the ride-along, they were targeting a criminal illegal alien who had been convicted of child sexual abuse. The agents could see a child on the individual's property, but they could not enter the home because they are not given a warrant. Instead, they have to wait until the criminal comes outside or is in a public space, and then they're able to apprehend him. That's why it is so important that local law enforcement work with our ICE agents. In Democrat cities with sanctuary policies, however, our federal law enforcement is facing an uphill battle. Recently, amid violent anti-ICE riots in Los Angeles, a mob surrounded ICE agents who had taken an illegal alien into custody. Amid the commotion, a group of men jumped out of a van and grabbed the suspect, helping him flee from the agents. According to recent reports, LAPD refused to send out an alert to track down the vehicle. They didn't want to run afoul of LA's sanctuary city policies. What we also know is these ICE agents nationwide have seen a 5 500% increase in attacks against them. Now, all of this should not be happening in our nation's cities, which is why Congress should do everything that we can to support the ICE agents and work to make America safe again. My CLEAR Act would ensure that state and local law enforcement officials have the explicit authority to assist federal government resources in our immigration enforcement efforts, codifying the 287G program that is absolutely so critical to local law enforcement. I also introduced legislation that would make it illegal to dox federal immigration officials who are working to protect our communities. Last month, Nashville's Democrat mayor did exactly that, handing information about federal law enforcement agents on a silver platter to criminal gangs. Meanwhile, House Democrat leader Jeffries said ICE agents should be unmasked, no matter what it takes, no matter how long it takes. This appalling effort from Democrats comes at the time when, as I said, these agents are facing a 500% increase in assaults. 500%. Just last week, a criminal illegal alien in Minnesota used his car to drag an ICE officer 50 yards while that criminal was trying to evade arrest. President Trump and Republicans understand that law enforcement deserves our unwavering support. That's why we're going to do what it takes to help them. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the next portion of my remarks be placed separately in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. This weekend, the U.S. military did something absolutely incredible. With Operation Midnight Hammer, the United States of America wiped out Iran's nuclear program. For years, the Islamic Republic has unleashed chaos across the Middle East with terrorism, murder, and violence. All the while, they worked to develop nuclear weapons while they were chanting, "Death to Israel and death to America." Now, under President Trump's decisive leadership, that threat is eliminated, thanks to the bravery, valor, and unmatched capability of the U.S. military. It is hard not to be in awe when you read the details of the operation. Departing from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, our service members flew 7 B-2 Spirit bombers for 18 hours to Iran's nuclear sites, dropped more than 400,000 pounds in bunker buster bombs, and returned home with 0 casualties. At the same time, a U.S. submarine under U.S. Central Command launched more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles at the regime's nuclear infrastructure. Supporting the operation were more than 125 aircraft, including dozens of aerial refueling tankers. Make no mistake, we have the only military on the planet that could get this job done, and it's because our brave service members are the greatest fighting force in the history of the world. Every single American should be grateful for the men and women who carried out Operation Midnight Hammer. Because of their efforts, a ceasefire has already been reached between Israel and a much weaker Iran. This is what peace through strength looks like, and only the U.S. military under President Trump's leadership could accomplish this feat. I yield the floor. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate resume legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have 10 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on the Judiciary be discharged from further consideration, and the Senate now proceed to S-Res 290.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 290, commemorating June 19, 2025 as Juneteenth National Independence Day in recognition of June 19, 1865, the date on which news of the end of slavery reached the slaves in the southwestern states.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate now proceed to the en bloc consideration of the following resolutions which are at the desk: S-Res 303, S-Res 304.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measures en bloc? Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the resolutions en bloc.
I ask unanimous consent that the resolutions be agreed to, the preambles be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table, all en bloc.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes the business today, it stand in recess until 3:30 p.m. on Thursday, June 26, that following the prayer and pledge, the Journal of Proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and the Senate proceed to executive session and resume consideration of Executive Calendar Number 93, Kenneth Kies. Finally, if any nominations are confirmed during Thursday's session of the Senate, the motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table, and the President be notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand in recess under the previous order, following the remarks of my Democratic colleagues.
Without objection. The Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, over the decades, there's a lot of conversation here in the Senate about deficits and debt. And every now and then, there's a significant bipartisan effort to take on that challenge in a responsible way. But the biggest historic bipartisan effort occurred in 1974, just over half a century ago. And in that effort, Democrats and Republicans together said, let's start using honest numbers when we're engaged in spending and revenue raising, so we'll quit having smoke and mirrors, quit pretending things are not what they are, quit selling, if you will, lipstick on a pig. Well, that effort created the Congressional Budget Office to get nonpartisan estimates. That effort created a strategy of saying we will have a regular budgeting process, and for reducing the deficit, we'll have a special process called reconciliation, only for reducing the deficit. And that special process had three very significant components. One was the reconciliation would not be used to create any deficits in the budget window, that is, in the 10-year window. The second is that it would not create any deficits in any single title, in any single year, any year after the first 10 years. And the third was that they would use, all of us would use, the nonpartisan numbers delivered to us on revenue through the Joint Committee on Taxation and on programs through the Congressional Budget Office. What an idea. We're going to be honest with ourselves, and we're going to be honest with the American people about what our decisions cost. But along the way, my Republican colleagues preached fiscal responsibility, but became the masters, the kings of fiscal irresponsibility. Let's look at the ways that they ran up deficit and debt here in the United States of America. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, $8 trillion, not to mention the incredible loss of life, some 7,000 service members, more than 50,000 service members with serious injuries. And continuing on their deficit and debt-creating rampage, there was the Bush tax cuts in 2001, and the second Bush tax cuts of 2003, and the Trump tax cuts of 2017, all creating an ocean of red ink, compromising the opportunity for us to do right by American families in health care, housing, education, great investments in technology and job creation, because there is no government program that's better than a good-paying job. All of it compromised from the Republicans' ocean of red ink. But just making program decisions that created red ink wasn't enough for my colleagues across the aisle. No, they decided to tear down the 1974 structure for fiscal responsibility. In 1996, they proceeded to say, you know what? We want to do a tax bill that will vastly lower taxes on the richest Americans, and we know it will create a mountain of deficit and debt. Democrats aren't going to vote for that, they said, and they were right. So they said, let's get a ruling. Let's get a ruling that allows us to do deficit creation with reconciliation, even though all 100 senators voted for reconciliation as a special filibuster-free pathway only for deficit reduction. It was really a dark moment for the Senate. The majority brought in a new parliamentarian to get a ruling that reversed what everyone had understood in the 1974 law. And then they proceeded to use it 3 times already in 2001, 2003, 2017, and now they're doing it a 4th time. More red ink. And that amount is about $3.4 trillion. And over 30 years, the debt they're creating as compared to current law is over 30 trillion of additional debt. 30 trillion. So please, don't come to this floor, I say to my colleagues across the aisle, and preach fiscal responsibility. If you can't walk the walk, don't talk the talk. There's one way to be fiscally responsible, and that's not to vote for a bill that creates $3.4 trillion in debt over 10 years and more than $30 trillion in debt over the next 30 years. That's the way you be fiscally responsible. You do it with action, because actions speak louder than words. It's part of what makes Americans so cynical, to hear speeches about fiscal responsibility and then see the actions are the exact opposite. But there is a sense of embarrassment among many of my colleagues across the aisle, because they've given speeches back home about fiscal responsibility, so they don't like the idea of voting for a bill that creates $3.4 trillion in debt over 10 years as compared to current law, or more than $30 trillion in debt over 30 years as compared to current law. So they said, let's create a magic math baseline that pretends these provisions don't create debt. That is just a horrific strategy, to lie to ourselves, to lie to the American people about what this bill costs. This little myth being foisted on this chamber and the American people. They put a fancy name on it. They called it Current Policy Baseline. So let's revisit what's happened to the 1974 law. It said no deficit creation in a 10-year period. And Republicans tore that down in 1996 and used it now 3 times, and now today a 4th time this week to create an ocean of red ink. Second of all, that 1974 agreement was there be no deficit created in any title in any year after that 10-year window. This bill, this reconciliation bill, is tearing that down right now, the second main pillar being devastated because they're making the tax cuts permanent and then creating a phony baseline to say it doesn't really create additional deficits far into the future. But everybody in America knows it does. Everybody in America knows that they're creating a phony baseline, doing exactly what was done before 1974, taking us to the same place where we're deceiving ourselves or attempting to and deceiving the American people. And then third of all is that they're tearing down the integrity of using honest numbers. So they tore down the 10-year agreement, no deficits in the first 10 years. Now they're tearing down the second pillar, no deficits in any title in any year after the first 10 years. And now they're also tearing down the third pillar, be honest about the numbers. Now this strategy, my colleagues across the aisle are saying, well, there's this provision in the budgeting law called Section 312, and it gives the Budget Committee the power to resolve technical difficulties when we come to costing out programs. But what I am conveying to you right now is this not in the section of the law that deals with reconciliation. Section 310 deals with reconciliation. Section 313 deals with reconciliation. But Section 312, no. So here's what we have. This provision, the Republicans are saying they want to use to give the budget chairman the power to create an artificial baseline to pretend this bill doesn't cost and to be able to extend debts far into the future or deficits far into the future, creating more debt. It's never been used in a partisan manner before. Here are the times it's been used in all these different ways: Crime Victims Fund, Power Marketing Administrations, preventing double counting of dairy program, adjustments to the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Every single time, a technical difficulty worked out in a bipartisan fashion. But I can assure you there's nothing bipartisan now about trying to use this in reconciliation. This provision from 312, has it ever been used in this broad fashion, even on a regular budget bill, on a broad fashion? No, it's been used on very narrow issues, time after time, in a bipartisan fashion. But that's being violated here. And has it been used not to resolve an ambiguity, but to hide trillions of dollars of cost? No, it's always been used in that bipartisan, on a narrow issue, to resolve an ambiguity in costing out a program, until now. And to my core point, this power doesn't exist in the section of the budget bill that addresses reconciliation. Again, there's a regular budget process, there's a reconciliation process. So it's never been used in reconciliation. So the last point I'll make on this is because it's been narrow, because it's been resolving technical ambiguities, it's also addressed much more modest amounts of numbers. Normally in the millions, one time 2.8 billion, but now it's being used to hide the $37 trillion score of this bill over 30 years. What a difference in every possible way. So I say to my colleagues, don't tear down honesty and integrity in accounting for provisions. You know, Section 313, if you go through it, it has different clauses. It says, establish the impact on outlays or revenue for each provision. Now, What that means is you take that provision that's in the bill and you say, if it's in the bill, what is the impact on program costs and revenue? But if it's not in the bill, what is the impact and how does that compare? That's what costing out each provision means. It's inherently a comparison to existing law. Now, there's some inherent inconsistencies that accentuate the point I'm making. If one uses this magic math to say you're going to assume that every tax provision that was in 2017 would have been automatically extended so it costs nothing, then you would have to also assume that every tax provision that is ended in this reconciliation bill after a couple years would also continue forever. But that's not the way that Republicans asked it to be costed out. So they're having it both ways. An existing provision that they want to extend, they say, well, it would have been extended anyway, so it costs nothing. A provision that they are ending, they're saying, reduce the cost of this bill because we're ending the provision and we're assuming no one would ever dare to extend it. That's just totally inconsistent, and it explains clearly that this is a gimmick. Gimmick, capital G-I-M-M-I-C-K, gimmick. A gimmick, smoke and mirrors to deceive ourselves and the American people. Or let's take this. In that same reconciliation bill, there is a provision to lift the debt limit by some $5 trillion. The Senate Republicans increased it from the House that wanted to increase it by $4 trillion. And they're saying this is enough to cover the next 2 years because we're going to increase the debt so much we need to have a $5 trillion cover. Well, if their story about the baseline, meaning that we're telling the people that this bill doesn't cost anymore, or costs very little compared to the Congressional Budget Office score of $3.4 trillion, they wouldn't need to increase the debt ceiling on top of what the House has already increased it. So let's come back to the core here. 100 senators came together, created a responsible framework to bring control over deficits. No deficits in a 10-year period under reconciliation. Republicans broke it. No deficits in a single title in a single year after 10 years. Republicans are breaking it with this bill. Using honest numbers, Republicans breaking it in this bill. Let's not break it. Let's say no. Every single colleague who's talked about fiscal responsibility, walk the walk. Tell your leadership, we are not going to have this situation where we're voting for a bill that creates deficits decades into the future. The only reason that score isn't higher than $37 trillion of additional debt over current law is because CBO cut off the accounting after 3 decades. So, colleagues, we're going to be voting on this bill probably Friday night. Maybe it's going to be 3 a.m. Saturday morning. Maybe it's going to be later on Saturday. But this bill doesn't deserve to go out of the Senate. This bill absolutely shatters the remaining provisions for fiscal accountability in terms of the structure that was worked out in 1974. And it creates massive debt over a 10-year period as compared to current law. And here's the rub. It creates this debt primarily to give tax breaks to the richest Americans. It cuts health care for 16 million Americans to give tax breaks to the richest Americans. It leaves 4 million children hungry to give tax breaks to the richest Americans. It runs up $3.4 trillion in debt over 10 years to give tax breaks to the richest Americans. This is families lose, billionaires win. That is a terrible strategy for America. So simply say no. Oh, I know how much the tribal bonds are within the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, but it's our responsibility here on the floor to listen to each other and to vote honestly about the impact of this bill. And this impact, hurting families, helping billionaires, is simply the wrong direction for the United States of America. Let's vote it down and work together for a vision in which families thrive and billionaires, they pay their fair share. Thank you, Mr. President.
The senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I rise today to urge my colleagues, my Republican colleagues, to reverse course on their proposal that would take affordable health care away from the many patients across the United States who will suffer, I believe, financial strain, and the financial strain will be put on the rest of us in our healthcare system. Despite the talking points that you hear from our colleagues, they do propose on Medicaid to really make cuts that will hurt us. This isn't about waste, fraud, and abuse. Their plan is to allow enhanced premium tax credits to expire. That has really nothing to do with lowering cost on average Americans. And this whole idea, in my mind, is a veiled attempt to repeal the expanded coverage that we saw for Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. Why is that important? Well, it's critically important because Medicaid has been the cornerstone of, in the Affordable Care Act, expanding care to working families that could not find an affordable insurance policy. Medicaid gave them that coverage. And now, with the proposal by our Republican colleagues, they are going to cut Medicaid and thus cut families who need the assistance to cover insurance to get the coverage they deserve. The result will be that Medicaid is stripped away, coverage in the ACA marketplace will become more unaffordable, and premiums for even employer-based insurance will go up. But that's what happens when you take dollars out of the system. In fact, we're already seeing some of these prices start to go up. Our healthcare system relies on people being insured so that they can pay for care. And when you dismantle that, the medical costs for everybody goes up. It only makes sense. Uncompensated care gets cost into the system that is passed on to the rest of us. Earlier this month, the Congressional Budget Office confirmed that the House's reconciliation bill, if enacted, would cause 16 million people to become uninsured. So that's the Congressional Budget Office. So again, 16 million people currently insured. Now all of a sudden uninsured means cost to the system, to say nothing of the cost of these individuals. Just as eye-popping is the projection that this proposal will drive up premiums and out-of-pocket spending for millions of people struggling to afford private insurance plans through the ACA marketplace or those with employer-provided coverage. A news analysis by the Center for American Progress proves that working-class families and people with all types of insurance will have to foot the bill for these harmful policies. For Medicaid, a family of 4 making $33,000 per year could see additional cost and co-payments up to $1,600 in annual out-of-pocket spending. I guarantee you these are people that already have had a tough time finding affordable insurance. For an ACA market plan, a 6-year-old couple making $85,000 a year who want to keep the same plan could see their annual premiums increase. And these are numbers according to the Center for American Progress, And you could even see the cost of an annual premium be as much as $15,000 a year. So these are all costs that we don't need to see increase. But if you are taking people who have affordable insurance and displacing them, according to CBO, 16 million of them, I guarantee you that cost will be absorbed by the rest of us. For Medicare, which President Trump pledged not to cut, low-income seniors who qualify for both Medicare and Medicaid will see their out-of-pocket expenses rise. For example, an older couple on Medicare living on an annual income of $21,000 could face an additional $8,000 in annual health care costs, actually $8,340. So this just shows that cutting almost $1 trillion in health care from funding and making millions of people be uninsured does not save the money. It basically gets into the system and other people are paying the cost. The Affordable Care Act lowered the individual uninsured rate from 17.8% in 2010 to a historic low of 9.5% in 2024. So we significantly decreased the number of uninsured. This drop in uninsured Americans improved people's health, saved money for individuals, saved money for families. It helped states. It even helped our state government. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, thanks to improved access to general health services, cancer screenings, and other forms of preventative care, Medicaid expansion alone lowered health-related mortality rates by 3.6%. So funding these issues, funding available insurance under the Affordable Care Act drove down the mortality rate and helped substantially save money. By contributing to a more robust economy, better societal well-being, lower mortality rates, it also helps states generate more than $20 billion in increased tax revenue and welfare savings. So covering people, I like the best example of this is the former Vice President of the United States. As a congressman, Congressman Mike Pence didn't vote for the Affordable Care Act. But when he became governor of Indiana, everybody in Indiana, the healthcare providers and others, convinced him, oh, it's a good idea. You should get people covered in your state. And they did. So this is about a smart way of providing health care, and we've done it. And so far, states spent a total of $19.9 billion to expand Medicaid. So states who were smart about this realized that their economy was better, their access to affordable insurance was better, that it was revenue stimulating the economy was better. They knew that the Medicaid expansion literally kept people alive. We should not reverse that. We've made great progress in the past 15 years to keep Americans healthier and financially secure. Allowing 16 million people, including 306,000 people from the state of Washington, to become uninsured is a bad idea. Without any alternatives, this will be a shock to our healthcare system. It will bring it to the breaking point and threaten the very lives of our constituents. I would like to take a moment, Mr. President, to read a letter from my constituent highlighting the concerns and fears about the impacts of the budget reconciliation bill. Britton Winterrose from Richland, Washington, is father to a joyful 5-year-old girl named Leda. He said he wrote to me because, quote, without Medicaid, my daughter's next nap could be her last, end quote. So now I want to read a letter from the Winterrose family. Quote, Leda entered the world at the height of the pandemic and spent the first 45 days of her life in the neonatal intensive care unit. Doctors finally identified a rare form of congenital central sleep apnea. If she falls asleep without oxygen, she simply stops breathing and she will die. The only path out of the hospital was a Medicaid waiver that paid for the in-home nursing and life support equipment. Medicaid gave us the opportunity to bring her home, surround her by her siblings, surround her of normalcy and safety and the love of her parents. Since that day, Medicaid has kept up with Lada's needs as she has grown. A toddler who once needed a walker now sprints across the yard because the program funded the therapy and a walker that strengthened her legs. It provided her with a bed that keeps her secure so the equipment stays connected and we can all sleep at night. Each stage of development adds new hardware, new software, new supplies, new specialists, feeding supplies, feeding pumps, G-tubes, sensors, diapers, respite care, and an AEC device to help my nonverbal autistic daughter communicate. Private insurance, even the Platinum plan that comes with my job, rarely covers these costs. There is not a private health insurance on the planet that covers the edge cases of human existence for somebody with the medical complexities of Leda. Tonight, like every night, my wife and I will hook our daughter to an oxygen concentrator and a pulse oximeter, then we'll lie down and say no to death. The only reason we can sleep at all is because Medicaid has provided the durable medical equipment and supplies needed to support her. From the days at the neonatal intensive care unit until now, one thing has become obvious. The last question on anybody's mind when they are trying to keep a child or loved one from dying should be, how can we afford these things? I do not speak only for Leda. The bill before Congress would strike thousands of Washingtonians from the rolls, and when that happens, clinics and long-term care facilities will collapse. That blow lands on veterans, on cancer patients, on newborns in rural communities, and it surely lands on my family. No one wakes up and decides, oh, I want to be disabled today. Everyone's health is a roll of the dice. Medicaid is how we make sure the roll of the dice is not fatal. I still lose sleep over what will happen when I'm gone. As a tired dad, help me rest. Please defend and strengthen Medicaid so that Leda and every child like her and those who are rightfully dependent on this system can live and thrive. That is the end of the letter from my constituent from Richland, Washington. What an incredible story of how a family is dependent on Medicaid. Today I met with organization and individuals from it, Moms Rising, where families from Washington State and all over the country came to protest the cuts to Medicaid and SNAP. I heard myself countless examples of how these programs are critical to families, to their well-being, and how this program, if cut, would be devastating. There is a common theme, Mr. President, on all these stories. These families are scared. They will not be able to afford or get the care that their family really relies on. They are also concerned that there is nowhere to turn, even if the coverage is taken away. Does this mean these patients will no longer need care or their illnesses will just magically go away? We all know that doesn't happen. This means that uninsured patients will wait to see a doctor until they're so sick they have to go to the ER, which costs more. This will lead to increased costs across the board. Specifically, it's estimated that 5.4 million Americans will incur medical debt because they will become uninsured, and the total medical debt that Americans owe will increase by $50 billion. I think this is numbers from the Center for American Progress. Hospital providers will have to shoulder an additional $36 billion in uncompensated care costs, and a portion of the costs will be recouped by increased premiums on employment-based insurance coverage. As a result, people with employment-based insurance will also see an additional anywhere from $180 to $485 in annual cost increases. That's what happens when you increase the cost of uncompensated care and the system has to make up for it somewhere. You increase everyone's costs. This is particularly damaging in the area of certified community behavioral health. I'm sure the president knows that behavioral health, very tough challenge, particularly with the fentanyl epidemic in our country. I met with representatives of Peninsula Behavioral Health in Port Angeles, Washington, and Sound Health in King County, who told me that clinics are already operating on narrow margins and have already sustained a 1% budget cut this year at the state level. If Congress passes the budget reconciliation bill and enact policies like the suggestion on the state-directed caps, state-directed payment caps, they will have to reduce their budget by 20%, meaning they'll have to cut staff and lay off people. As a result, patients who rely on them for substance abuse treatment will be left out in the cold. We literally will see an increase in overdose deaths, law enforcement run-ins, and incarceration rates. Where do you think these people go when they don't have behavioral health treatment for fentanyl? All this costs taxpayers more, actually a lot more than just covering Medicaid. It would be better if we just kept the Medicaid program and funded patients so they could get the care when they needed it. My Republican colleagues know that this bill will cause harm. Hospitals and physicians and various leaders across the industry are at their doorsteps telling them not to hollow out our healthcare system. But I beg my colleagues to drill down and listen to the fact that the revenue that rural hospitals particularly live on are huge Medicaid, Medicare budgets. That means there is no margin to have a 20% decrease in funds. Spending money to fix a problem caused by not spending money doesn't seem the smart thing to do. The logic doesn't make sense. In fact, it sounds to me like waste and fraud to say to people that you're going to somehow make this a better system when in reality you are going to cut care and increase cost on all of us. Passing this bill and enacting these policies will only hurt working class and middle class Americans. Americans are still reeling from the effects of inflation, to say nothing about the tariffs. This is not the time to be taking away health care coverage or increasing premiums on anyone. We have already seen enough inflation. For most families, any extra money from a tax cut will be swallowed up by these higher health care costs. And every time a new report or analysis is done on this bill, the outlook gets more challenging for people at home. If we really had this serious of a waste, fraud, and abuse problem in Medicaid, why haven't we had hearings on it? Why haven't we had legislation trying to fix it? Why haven't we had, communication that this is a real issue? Because it's not a real issue. What is a real issue is Congress has been trying to fix the uninsured problem by passing the Affordable Care Act. It has worked successfully, and now our colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to try to repeal it. I hope that my colleagues will realize the only thing that you can know for sure about this proposal that cuts Medicaid, the only thing we know for sure is that thousands of Americans will become sicker and will become poorer. Because without the access to care, that is exactly what's going to happen. I urge my colleagues to really understand the harmful effects of this legislation, understand the harmful health effects on the citizens of our country, and I ask them to reject these Medicaid cuts. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President. The so-called reconciliation bill, or Mr. Trump's big, beautiful bill that the Republican leadership is now attempting to rush through the Senate, is a rather extraordinary piece of legislation. In many respects, given the crises facing our country, this legislation does exactly the opposite of what should be done. Whether you are a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent, you know, no one has any doubt about it, that our current healthcare system is broken, it is dysfunctional, it is a cruel system, and it is wildly expensive. We spend over $14,500 per person on health care, double what most countries around the world pay per person. And despite all of that spending, some 85 million Americans today are uninsured or underinsured, and we remain the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a human right. And 1 out of 4 people who go into a pharmacy to get their prescription drugs can't afford that medicine because of the outrageously high prices. So, now given that reality, how does this reconciliation bill address the horrific health care crisis that our country is experiencing? What one might think is that given 85 million people being uninsured or underinsured, this bill would lower that number. It would provide health care to more Americans. Given the fact that we are spending twice as much per capita on health care as any other nation, one might think that this legislation would lower the cost of health care. Given the fact that the insurance companies and the drug companies rip us off every day and make huge profits out of the system, one might think that this legislation would take on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry and the insurance companies. Well, if that is what you think rational legislation should do, understand that this bill does none of that, in fact, does exactly the opposite. This legislation, if enacted, would make the largest cut to health care in our nation's history in order to pay for the largest tax breaks for the rich that we have ever seen. Massive cuts to health care in order to provide tax breaks for billionaires. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that this legislation would cut Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act by over $1 trillion. Those cuts, along with ending the enhanced premium credits for the ACA, will lead to 16 million people losing their health insurance. That is not what Bernie Sanders has said. That is what the director of the Congressional Budget Office has told us. That is the nonpartisan group that works for Congress. Mr. President, this bill, further, for the first time, forces millions of Medicaid recipients who make as little as $16,000 a year to pay a $35 copayment every time they visit a doctor. So, 16 million people are thrown off of health care. Low-income working-class people now forced to pay a $35 copayment. So what is the impact of all of that? Well, it will not surprise anybody. If people don't have access to health care, if they can't get to a doctor when they are sick, people will suffer, and tens of thousands of them will die. The Yale University School of Public Health and the University of Pennsylvania estimated in a recent study that if the reconciliation bill is enacted, over 50,000 Americans will die unnecessarily every year. That is what we are talking about. 50,000 Americans dying unnecessarily because they're thrown off of health care. They can't afford to see a doctor each and every year. And what's the reason for that? What's the motivation for that horrific action? It is to give massive tax breaks to the very wealthiest people in this country, people who do not need them. And Mr. President, not only would millions of Americans lose their health insurance and tens of thousands of our constituents needlessly die, if this legislation is enacted, rural hospitals all over this country, rural hospitals that are already struggling, would be forced to shut down, lay off workers, or substantially reduce the services they provide. In other words, at a time when rural America is struggling, and I come from one of the most rural states in America, that is what Vermont is, this bill would be a disaster for rural America. Further, when Trump and the Republicans in Congress make massive cuts to Medicaid, they are not just attacking individuals, they are also going after and negatively impacting community health centers, which provide primary health care to 32 million low-income and working-class Americans in every state in this country. Community health centers rely on Medicaid for 43% of their revenue, and when you cut hundreds of billions of dollars in Medicaid, you are significantly cutting back on the access that millions of Americans will have to the primary health care they desperately need. So, at a time when the health care system in America is broken, when primary health care is even in worse shape, this will make access to primary health care even more difficult. Mr. President, some 22% of our seniors in this, the richest country on earth, are trying to survive on less than $15,000 a year. And this legislation will make it harder for seniors and people with disabilities to receive the care they desperately need in nursing homes. Nursing homes in Vermont, and I expect in every state in this country, are struggling. They're understaffed. Workers there are underpaid. The quality in many cases is not as good as it should be. But when Medicaid now provides 60% of the revenue nursing homes rely on, slashing Medicaid will make a disastrous situation even worse for some of the most vulnerable people in our country. So, Mr. President, let us be clear. Let us not run away from it. Let us not double talk this issue and come up with all kinds of absurd rationalizations. This legislation coming before the Senate this week is the most significant attack on the health care needs of the American people in the modern history of our country. And once again, we are throwing millions of people off the health care that they depend upon to stay alive in order to give tax breaks to billionaires who have more wealth today than they will need for 100 lifetimes. And yet, Mr. President, oddly enough, despite the enormity of what this legislation is about, not a single committee in the Senate has held a single hearing on the impact this legislation will have. And in my view, really, This is absolutely irresponsible. I'm not quite sure why we continue to even have committees if the Health and Labor Committee, of which I am ranking member, does not hold a hearing on the most important piece of health legislation in the modern history of this country. And that is why this morning I released, as the leader of the minority on the committee, a report discussing the impact that this legislation would have on our nation's healthcare system. And I did that by doing something pretty radical, I guess. We actually reached out to healthcare providers all over the country. You know, if you're going to decimate American healthcare, you may want to talk to the doctors and the nurses and the healthcare organizations around America. I think it's kind of a common sense thing to do. And let me take this opportunity to thank the over 750 healthcare providers from 47 states who responded to my request. I want to thank them sincerely for their thoughtful responses. We basically said, well, what is this legislation going to do in your state? And we got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of responses. And Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that this entire report be included in the congressional record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, let me just summarize and quote some, a small number of the responses that we got. If this legislation were to be signed in law, it would drive up the number of uninsured Americans in every single state in this country. For example, if this legislation was signed into law, the uninsured rate in my state of Vermont would go from 3.3% to 6%. In Louisiana, the uninsured rate would go from 6.7% to 12.4%. In the state of Washington, the uninsured rate would go up from 6.2 to 11%. In Florida, the uninsured rate would go up from 10.4% to 18.8%. Almost 19% of people in Florida will be uninsured if this bill goes through. And this is true for every state in the country, in many cases an almost doubling of the number of uninsured. And now let me just quote for you what healthcare providers and state organizations around the country are saying as to the horrific impact that this legislation would have. Now, I know many of my Republican colleagues are getting up and they're saying, oh, it's not true, it's this, that, and the other thing. Listen to the doctors, listen to the organizations, the healthcare providers in your own state. Let me just begin with Texas, Dr. Audrey Nath, where the uninsured rate will reach 20%. And anybody from Texas watching this, you're going to be, if this bill goes through, you might want to say hello to your senators here, your uninsured rate is going to go up to 20%. And this is what Dr. Audrey Nath wrote, quote, these cuts will cause rural hospitals in Texas to close entirely. As a neurologist, I am terrified that the closest hospital for many rural folks may then be hours away. During an ischemic stroke, there is only 3 hours of precious time. You get a stroke, you got to get care very quickly. And she writes that the increased travel time may cause unnecessary cases of paralysis and death, end of quote. That is obviously what happens not only for stroke, but for many other illnesses if you don't have a hospital nearby. Dr. Farham Malik from Florida, where the uninsured rate will surge to almost 19%, wrote, quote, plainly said, Children will die as a result of these cuts. Hospitals will cut back on ICU doctors. Doctors will leave because of salary cuts. Critical ancillary services will be reduced, and more medical students will avoid going into pediatric residencies, end quote. Dr. Maya Henderson, who works at a community health center in Missouri, wrote that the cuts to Medicaid contained in this legislation would mean, quote, that we may not be able to keep the doors open of a community health center. We would potentially have to stop caring for many of our patients, end quote. The Louisiana Rural Health Association wrote, and I quote, Louisiana's rural hospitals and health care providers are already operating on razor-thin margins, struggling to keep their doors open while serving some of our most medically vulnerable communities. In Louisiana, 38% of hospitals operate on negative margins, and 27% are currently vulnerable to closure. Medicaid cuts would worsen these losses, putting more hospitals at risk of shutting down entirely. Dr. Sanjay Chaubey, a doctor from Louisiana, told the Health Committee, quote, the proposed cuts to Medicaid will cause untold hardship and deaths among my patients. Don't do this, he puts in capital letters. You don't want the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans on your hands. That is Dr. Chaubey from Louisiana. Dr. Gregory Omlor from Akron's Children's Hospital in Ohio told us that, quote, if the proposed bill is passed and my patient's Medicaid insurance is cut, it doesn't mean their asthma will go away. It will mean that in most cases they will not receive preventative care and some children will die of their asthma, end quote. And here's what another doctor from Ohio said, and I quote, implementing work requirements into Ohio Medicaid will threaten my patients' gains. Most of my patients want to work. They are desperate to. There just aren't jobs available for folks with very low skills and health conditions that could cause them to miss work unexpectedly. The jobs that are available do not pay enough for an adult to survive, and they certainly don't offer health insurance. My patients who rely on Medicaid have frequently been born into generational poverty, have only had access to poor quality schools, and live in neighborhoods where their health suffers, end of quote. And by the way, this Dr. Omlor talks about work requirements. Let us understand, Mr. President, that every single year, millions and millions and millions of Americans lose their jobs. Not through any fault of their own, their company shuts down, company goes bankrupt, whatever it may be, they lose their jobs. They don't have a job. Well, how are they going to get health care? Well, we've taken health care away from them because they're not working. The Vermont Association of Hospitals, my own state, the Association of Hospitals and Health Systems wrote that this bill, quote, reduces coverage and access, particularly in rural areas such as Vermont, where hospitals and other health care providers are already financially fragile, and that it will force hospitals in Vermont to cut back on clinical staff services and care delivery. I can tell you, hospitals in Vermont are struggling. This will make a very, very difficult situation even worse. Now, Mr. President, I got a radical idea, probably one that I would say 70 or 80% of the American people agree with. And that is maybe, just maybe, instead of throwing 16 million people off of health care, instead of creating a situation where 50,000 Americans die unnecessarily, why don't we do what every other major country on earth does and guarantee health care to all people as a human right. What do you got that, Mr. President? Instead of throwing 16 million people off so we have almost 100 million uninsured, hey, why don't we do what Canada does, what the UK does, what Spain does, what Finland does, what Holland does, what every other major country on earth does? Guarantee health care to all people as a human right. But the problem there is it is easier to throw working people off of their health insurance around here than to take on the big money interests who run the insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry. That's what this is about. Mr. President, in many respects, this bill represents exactly why many Americans are giving up on democracy and have such contempt for Congress and for the Democratic Party and for the Republican Party. At a time when the richest people have never, ever had it so good, they now see Republican leadership working overtime to make the billionaire class even wealthier. At a time when a majority of Americans are struggling to put food on the table and pay for health care, they see Republican leadership making life even more difficult for average Americans. So, Mr. President, I would say that I speak for the overwhelming majority of the American people who think that it is basically insane that we are talking about throwing 16 million people off the health care they have, creating a situation where 50,000 Americans will die unnecessarily each year in order to give hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars to billionaires and the wealthiest people in this country. This is a disastrous, obscene piece of legislation. It must be defeated. Thank you.
The Senate stands in recess until 3:30 p.m. tomorrow.